Hello and welcome to this edition of In Conversation, where we're talking about influencer marketing and more specifically, what does the future hold for influencer marketing? So I'm joined by Amy and Megan from our PR and content team. Okay, so there's a few people out there who probably see influencer marketing as having a bit of a negative reputation and with some negative connotations around influencer marketing among some people. Do you think that reputation is justified? Do you think it's fair?
No. I think a lot of the time it's with everything. The negative stories, they get the attention, they get the media coverage, they get people talking. And the Netflix documentary on the Fire Festival and how influencers had been used to promote something that could potentially be dubious caused a lot of issues and a lot of conversations around the industry, which I don't necessarily feel is fair. But that's just one example. There are hundreds of thousands of other examples where brands have worked successfully with influencers, their content's been well received by their followers, but the negatives can sometimes outshine the positives.
Yeah, I completely agree with what Amy's saying. I think it's always the case that some of the negative stories just shine in the media, so people jump off the back of that. I think we've become a lot more transparent now, the guidelines from the ASA as well. People understand that brands are going to work with influencers. People get that, it's disclosed, it's out there, it's not necessarily a bad thing. If it's done in the right way and if it's the relevant bloggers and influencers that are used, then it can only be a positive thing.
Yeah, influencer marketing is not what it was. It's not a case of a brand trying to slyly get in their message or slyly getting a link through influencer content. It's now a lot more collaborative. It's a lot more transparent about disclosing what that relationship is. So hopefully we'll see a lot of those negative connotations drop off over time, but it takes time to re-educate and ensure that ourselves in the industry, I suppose, are continuing to be as transparent and open as possible and just drive it forward.
I think that point about audiences that aren't necessarily following the traditional media anymore, they're not necessarily reading the papers, they're not looking at the traditional channels and platforms, and influencers can really cut through that.
Definitely.
Barrier. Yeah, okay. So it was interesting that the e-consultancy report in influencer marketing came out early this year, and it looked around a lot of the concerns and challenges that marketers are having, and there were some obvious or some quite common ones in there in terms of proving ROI and things like that, which is I suppose is common with a lot of channels. But one of the big ones, the biggest concern that came up was fake followers, and this challenge that brands have with, do they trust the followings that these influencers have? What's your view on that on that concern?
Yeah, it's something I see as being more of a problem of the past. It's still prevalent, but I think because influencer marketing is becoming more sophisticated, we look beyond how many followers somebody has. That isn't the beginning and end all of why we might recommend a certain influencer for a client. In fact, it's often very, very secondary. Factors that are more pressing are, say, the engagement that a person is getting, how active they are, how involved and interested their followers are in talking to them, in shaping the content that comes up. So I think if your campaign focus is more on those more qualitative factors, so the other elements beyond followers alone, then fake followers should be less of an issue because you're not just looking at that number, you're not shaping campaigns on that one figure. So that opens up who you'd work with and what the campaign would be.
Yeah, definitely. I agree. I think it is still a big problem. I think it's always going to be a problem because you have got people who have done it in the past, so it's always going to overshadow, like Amy said before, some of the positive stories. But I think the rise of micro-influencers and smaller followings that are more relevant, I think that's going to become a bigger thing. I think for some of our clients, I think it's much more relevant to use an influencer who has got a smaller following, but that following is super engaged. You're going to get more benefit out of that than to use one of the top tier influencers. I think there's still huge potential in using them, but I think it's just making sure the outcome is relevant to what your objectives are for that campaign, and that can change. So it's not that it's not an issue anymore. I think it's just the conversation is changing.
Yeah, it's becoming more forward thinking, and it's something we've definitely seen recently with some of our campaigns where we'll set KPIs for targeting, making sure we're getting a set amount of reach as one factor to help measure the campaign, but it's certainly not the only factor. There's one we've done recently I can think of where we've revisited the original pitch with a client and looked at the influencer portfolios who we could potentially reach that are in line with that brand, and have then thought on reflection, can we get hyper relevant people who have a following of say 50,000 followers or more for this brand for a short campaign? If the answer is no, do we need to revisit that and look at bringing down that following if it means that we're reaching people who are more relevant, more engaging, more in line with the brand, and more likely to reach those potential audience sectors that they might be not touching through through advertising? And just think about it, as Megan's saying, in a more real world sort of way and adapting accordingly.
I think there's just more metrics to consider now.
Certainly.
It used to be that following was the major key point, and with that has the backlash and the negativity has come, which you would kind of expect. But now, like Amy said, we want to look more at engagement, and are the people that are engaging on them post relevant? Are they the right people that we want to be targeting? And if so, I think it's much more beneficial to use that person if they've got a lower following than someone with triple the amount of followers.
No engagement.
And no engagement, or irrelevant.
Relevance being the key word, I think, is the words you two use more, don't you? And I think that's something, isn't it? It's not about the vanity metrics, it's about is the influencer the right match for the people you want to reach. With that in mind then, so have some of the problems we've seen with influencer marketing and some of the high profile fails, if you like, have they come from brands not really understanding what influencer marketing can do or what they want from influencer marketing?
I think so. I think with it all, it comes down to a knowledge on both the influencer and the brand, and I think sometimes there's a lack of knowledge on both parts, and I think education comes into that. I think the ASA's new guidelines, I think there needs to be a good knowledge on the influencer as well as the brand. It can't be one-sided. So I think there's still a long way to go in terms of getting everyone in line. But I think there probably was a knowledge gap.
Okay.
Yeah, to echo what Megan's saying there, I think part of the risk we can see with influencer marketing comes from there being a bit of a disjointed vision from what the brand would like an influencer to do and what the influencer would like to do. So there needs to be a compromise of making sure whatever those brand objectives are, whether it's awareness or sharing a hashtag or competition, whatever the current campaign is, that fits in with what the influencer is likely to create, the content they're already creating, and the kind of content their followers are used to seeing and engaging with. So there needs to be give and take at briefing stage to bring influencers in, really understand what they want to do, and try and compromise as much as we can to create the best relevant content that works for both parties. Otherwise, that is where we're seeing, or you can potentially see, a little bit of a backlash from followers if they feel that relevance is not there, if they find it very forced, as Megan said, if it's not transparent about being an ad, that can cause issues.
Yeah, again, I don't want to say relevancy too much,
Relevance.
but I think if you do target that influencer who is super relevant, you're going to get more from it. If that influencer is super passionate about your brand or that area of focus, then everyone's going to benefit more from it, and the followers, the people who are engaging on that, are just going to be more open to that, and they're not going to mind as much that they've been endorsed by that because it's believable, it's natural.
It comes through, doesn't it? Everyone has got a brand that they have an affinity to for whatever reason. There are brands that we like more than others, that are more invested in for whatever reason. It's natural to share that on social, depends on how much people share, but from an influencer perspective, they are influencers, they're not celebrities, they're regular people. And so some brands, they like to share. And when you can see that they are genuinely interested in that brand and when they're excited about that brand, it comes through in their content as well. So it can be really nice to see and really well received by the followers.
Yeah, I think the negativity comes when it doesn't look natural.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, there's been cases where that has come through, and I think that just the brand needs to make sure that they put their focus on finding the relevant people, and then it just looks natural.
So in terms of influencer marketing, it's one of those things where people say it can work as a standalone channel, but obviously it crosses over into other channels and tactics. So I mean, there are obvious parallels, for instance, with a tactic like PR, for example. So how important do you think it is to integrate influencer marketing with a channel such as PR or any other kind of tactic that you may use?
Yeah, it's definitely a consideration for the future, I suppose. So moving away from having an influencer say, try this product, it's really good, on their Instagram page, to building out a bigger campaign in a more traditional style, as a PR news generation campaign, as looking at the longer time periods. So how can you work with an influencer to create content that's got more shelf life, as opposed to just being posted once and then it fades down their newsfeed and eventually disappears. So in that point of view, I'd say it's definitely like PR, and it should be thought of more broadly in the way that PR campaign is, sort of longevity, what the creative angles are, how many influencers you might want to bring into that, but certainly an overlap in the overall digital approach, digital PR strategy, just bringing it in together a bit more so that the two are working and can support different elements as well. Because PR we might be using to particularly help benefit some SEO objectives, whereas from an influencer point of view, particularly if somebody's sharing content on a blog, that might not be the correct focus for the influencer support, because you don't really want to be using their links through them to drive traffic to sites. That's going to cause a few issues with Google's penalisation issues there. So it's just understanding that the two can have very different objectives, but that doesn't mean that they can't work together to build on the holistic digital strategy.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think the objectives need to be clear from the outset on why you want to use them influencers for your campaign. I think a lot of the time maybe people just think that that's the future, we need to use influencers, but I think it needs to fit in with what you're doing. And with that, which influencers you use, we've talked about micro-influencers, using them if you're setting up a new restaurant in London, say, it makes sense to use a super relevant micro-influencer from that area as opposed to a multinational, big-scale, top-tier influencer.
Yeah, it's random.
Yeah, I think it needs to look natural and relevant. So I think it's just making sure that the objectives are clear on both sides, like Ian said.
Okay. So you both use the word future, so let's come on to that. So what does the future hold for influencer marketing?
People concentrating on more than just one metric. I think the metrics that people look at are going to widen. People aren't just going to focus on one area anymore. It's going to be engagement, but that's just going to be one part of it. I think micro-influencers are going to become more and more popular. But that's not to say that the top tier aren't going to be useful as well, but I think people are going to become more and more open to using smaller influencers that are much more relevant to their brand than thinking they have to use all their budget on this one person.
Yeah, different objectives for different campaigns. It needs to be that flexibility, it needs to be fluid. Influencer marketing strategy changes pretty constantly. There's a lot of variables. The ASAs we've mentioned is another consideration. So I think a lot of the future of influencer marketing will be keeping up to date about wider landscape, whether it's legal, what the audience is doing, what the news is, and just understanding that we need to be flexible, and it's not a case of something that worked last year isn't necessarily going to work now, and just adapting accordingly.
Okay, so in terms of that issue on the micro-influencers and making sure that the influencer is relevant to the audience you want to attract, or the brand wants to attract, how do you guys go about ensuring that you are matching the right brand to that right influencer?
I think it's kind of a top-down approach. It may start very broad. Say if we're looking at food influencers, So we'll use one of our tools to pull out a load of UK food influencers, see what the pool is, and then start narrowing it down. So if we're considering metrics in terms of how much engagement they're getting as relative to the content that they post, that's something that'll be factored in. To an extent, their follower numbers will be factored in. It's a metric we consider. As we've said, it's not our priority number one, but we are aware of it and we do consider it to be one of our metrics. So then once we're filtering down based on those factors, we've found a load of people who we know are engaged, who have an engaged following, talking in the right space. But then we need to scrutinise them a bit more to understand the content they're producing, how often they're producing it. So can have some manual elements as well. So looking at an influencer's profile, their posts from, say, I don't know, looking at what they've posted earlier this year, what hashtags are they using, what themes are they going for, how can we categorise exactly what their specialism is. We've said food, but are they cooking, are they restaurant? Do we want to be working with people who are chefs or hobby chefs, or people who are more interested in touring restaurants? If it's the latter, we'll dismiss the former and then keep refining based on that process, so we know we're finding people who are absolutely relevant to what our campaign is. We know they're relevant to the brand. The brand will be interested in working with them, and also, really importantly, that influencer is going to look at our campaign, look at our project, and say, yeah, it's the sort of thing I've done previously. I may have done previous ads for brands within that space. So we know that they're more open to receiving or working with campaigns like this, more interested in brands like this. And it just makes the whole process a bit smoother. So yes, there's a lot of legwork at the front, but by the time we're speaking to influencers, it's quite rare we're getting people who are saying they don't want to work with us because we put in that time.
Yeah.
So it's a lot more rewarding.
And from the brand as well, I suppose it mitigates a lot of the risks that
And you want to see as well if they've worked with a competitor before, what sort of stuff have they posted? Are they always working with different brands? Would that put us off in this instance? There's a lot of different questions that we have to ask when we're scrolling down and kind of working out who's going to be the best fit.
Yeah.
So finally, what would be your top piece of advice you were going to give to a brand or a business that was looking to get involved in influencer marketing?
Set objectives. Know exactly what you want to get from the influencer project. Be realistic about them. Influencers shouldn't be relied on to drive a load of site traffic. That's not what they're for. Think about it in terms of awareness, other objectives and other goals you want to hit. That's from the start. When influencer collation starts, when you're building up the bank of who you're potentially working with, ensure there's timing for that. It's a long process to ensure that people are getting the engagement you want to see, have the other tangible metrics you want to see, but are also really relevant and open to working with particular brands. So putting in that legwork, we find leads to a high success rate with influencers wanting to work with the brands, but also with the brands wanting to work with those influencers. So if you put the time in at the start, the more likely the actual project is going to go ahead with minimal hiccups, be nice and smooth, and hit the objectives you set for it to do.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Just do your research, do lots and lots of research. It's probably the most important part of it. And don't be put off by what's out there in the news. As long as you're targeting the right people, it's going to pay off. And also think long term. It doesn't have to be a short term strategy. If you get the right influencers involved, it's going to benefit you on a longer relationship level.
Yeah, and think about how you want to use influencer content.
Yeah.
It might not be just something that appears on the feed once. You might want to reuse it for other marketing communication channels, whether it's email, whether it's advertising. That again is setting out your objectives beforehand, making sure that's clearly communicated to the influencers and that they're on board with those objectives and can support that as well.
Yeah, think about the objectives first. Don't just think, I want to work with influencers, so what can I do? Think about your campaign and then see if it naturally links well with using influencers.
I'm impressed we got through that question with absolute relevancy.
Oh, it's relevant.
So I think we've sold influencer marketing for everybody, I think it's fair to say. So Amy, Megan, thank you very much for joining us, and thank you for joining us on this edition of In Conversation. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button to make sure you don't miss the next edition. Thank you very much for joining us.